In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. So good to be back with you this morning. And actually, I'll be here next week too, because we have the visit of the bishop, and I hope you'll all come for that. And in addition to everything else that's wonderful about the bishop, he's a really good preacher. So be sure you're here for that as well. Should be a pretty festive day with a visit of the bishop and the dedication of the work that we've done so long and worked so many years to produce, to see the plaza dedicated, and so many people has given so much effort to. Now, shepherd and sheep figure prominently in the Bible. It's hard to read a page of the Bible without one or the other of those being on it. The first person that God called to follow him, Abraham, we know was a shepherd, and his children and grandchildren were shepherds. When the children of Israel came out of Palestine during the time of great famine out of the land of Canaan and went up to Egypt, when it was known that they were shepherds, Pharaoh gave them the land of Goshen for their sheep and for their herds. Now, when God called Moses, he was keeping sheep in the wilderness. And when God called Joseph, or enabled Joseph to do the great work that he did, we first see him as a shepherd. And then David, the greatest king of Israel, starts out as a shepherd boy, the least of his father's sons. And so we hear this morning where this psalm of David, where David sings of God as a shepherd. David sings that God provides the sheep with succulent grass, with clean water, and protection from darkness and danger. And in the second half of that poem moves from the sheep to the shepherd himself, the shepherd king, who is banqueted and sustained by God. And this is not the only place in the Old Testament where God is spoken of as a shepherd. In one of the most beautiful passages in the Bible, in Isaiah chapter 40, God comes to confront Israel, to comfort Israel, both battered by exile and return. And the prophet has God say, "Get you up to a high mountain," declares the prophet. "O Zion, herald of good news. Lift up and do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. He will lead the flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom, and greatly and gently lead the mother sheep." Once again, the theme of this is protection and care and gentleness. God comes to this battered people not in judgment, but in love. And then, of course, there's a New Testament where we also have a lot of sheep and shepherds. At Jesus' birth in the book of Luke, it is the shepherds to whom the angels announce his birth. And they use a word that is used by Isaiah 40, good news, or what we know as gospel. And also in Luke, there's that trio of stories about things that were lost and found. A lost sheep that is pursued and found, a lost coin that a woman pursues and finds, and then a lost son, a prodigal son that is lost and found. And then in the Gospel of John, Jesus himself is called the Lamb of God. But perhaps most famously is the passage that we read this morning, the Good Shepherd, Jesus as the Good Shepherd. The image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd is one that Reverend Rachel and those who work with our children have chosen to be the central, foundational image for Jesus. As the Good Shepherd, Jesus feeds and protects and loves and even sacrifices for the sheep. And this includes all of our children and youth for whom Jesus is a good shepherd, but also for all of you and for me as well. John's gospel is known for being both simple and profound at the same time. It's been said that John is like a pool that's shallow enough for a baby to swim in and deep enough for an elephant to swim in. And this passage, I think, is a prime example of this. At one level, it's very simple. Jesus tells them something that every Middle Eastern peasant would know. If you had a stranger that ran up to the sheepfold and threw the door open, the sheep would run out and scatter everywhere. If that same stranger tried to gather them, they would ignore him because they don't know his voice. The shepherd opens the sheepfold, they scatter again, but then he goes out in front of the sheep, and the sheep follow him because they do know his voice. But here the parable, for it is a parable, takes a rather dark turn. Because they're not only strangers who open gates and let the sheep run away, whom the sheep will ignore, but there are thieves and bandits that will plunder and abuse the sheep. The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. Jesus appears to be contrasting himself with what he considers to be false shepherds, people who take advantage of the sheep, people who simply use the sheep for their own benefit. Probably behind this is a passage in Ezekiel 34 where God denounces the false shepherds of Israel who had led them into disaster and exile, the rulers that had brought them to the brink of death. He accuses them of feeding themselves rather than the sheep. You eat the fat, you clothe yourself with wool, but you do not feed the sheep. These false shepherds fail to strengthen the weak. They let the sheep get scattered and lost and make no effort to find them. In other words, these false shepherds are everything Jesus isn't. They're rapacious and greedy. They're indifferent to the fate of the sheep. They're concerned for the sheep only to the extent that they benefit from them. It's a damning indictment, and no doubt was running through the minds of Jesus' hearers as he talked about being the good shepherd and warning them about thieves and bandits. There are always three contexts when you hear a passage from the gospel, three settings. The first setting is the original setting where Jesus says these words, the setting of his original listeners, their life situation, their world. The second setting is the situation of the writer some decades later. His situation, his world, the situation he's facing. And then there's the third setting, and that's our setting, our situation, who we are and what we're facing. All three of those settings are present every time we hear the gospel. For example, in Jesus' context, he's probably talking about the Jerusalem leadership that he believes is leading the people to disaster. Then the context of John, the writer, is probably some decades later when the young church is just beginning to get its feet under it, just beginning to flourish, and is facing challenges from false teachings. And then there's our own setting, the world in which we live, a time of confusing and insistent voices. Today, there are all kinds of religious leaders who are desperate to develop a following by claiming that they alone speak for Jesus. There are plenty of religious leaders who appear to think that they own Jesus and control Jesus. Some of them perhaps think they are Jesus. These are the kind of thieves and liars and bandits that Jesus warns about. These are the ones who climb over the wall to plunder the sheep. Jesus says, I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly. The thieves and the bandits care about themselves. Good shepherds are not about themselves, their own power, their own privileges, their own abundant life, but the abundant life of the sheep. Now, in John's Gospel, we have a story of a potentially bad shepherd that became a good shepherd, and that's Peter. In chapter 18 of John, Jesus is carried into the palace of Caiaphas, the high priest, and Caiaphas is going to question him and challenge him about who he is. And then, at the same time, we have Peter at the fire in the courtyard warming his hands. Now, Jesus shows a great deal of courage before Caiaphas in standing up to him. Peter shows a great deal of cowardice in not standing up to Caiaphas' servants. He denies Jesus. Although he's questioned directly about his knowledge of Jesus, about being a disciple of Jesus, he denies everything. He fails in both his duty as a disciple and as a seeker of lost sheep. He's not a very good shepherd. At the end of John's Gospel, when Jesus meets his disciples on the shoreline and fixes them breakfast, he engages Peter in a conversation. And he asks Peter 3 different times, "Do you love me?" Peter keeps saying that he does love him. "You know everything, Lord. You know I do love you." But Jesus keeps asking until John says Peter was grieved. He was hurt that Jesus kept asking him if he loved him. Jesus responds to Peter's profession of love with, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep." Peter's being restored, and he's being told now that his task is to stop thinking about himself, stop worrying about himself, and take up the task of being a good shepherd to feed and care for Jesus' sheep. Because here's the point: they are Jesus' sheep and not Peter's. Now, if Peter was the writer of the letter, 1 Peter, or one of his followers, someone who heard him preach and teach, Peter never forgot this. He tells the leaders of churches to tend the flock of God. Do not lord it over those in your charge, but be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will win the crown of glory that never fades away. All of you elders, all of you presbyters, Peter says, are under shepherds. The flock is not yours. It belongs to the chief shepherd. It belongs to Jesus. You are not there to lord it over the flock. You are not there to use the flock for your own benefit, but to care for them, even as Jesus did, even to the point of giving his life for them. Now, where am I going with all of this? I continue to pray that you will get a good shepherd, someone who will lead you into abundant life as Jesus leads us all, someone who serves Jesus' flock, who seeks out the lost, who protects, feeds, and loves as Jesus did. I hope you find a rector, a pastor, whom you will follow as they follow Jesus. Reading this passage this week and thinking about being here this Sunday, I couldn't help but think about this. But I want to remind you of something else. That each and every one of you who acts as a leader or a teacher in the church, you are also an under shepherd. You also have an obligation to the chief shepherd to sustain, protect, and care for the sheep, the flock of God's pasture. It's not just the rector, the priests, the deacons, the clergy that's in mind here. When we lead, all of us, wherever we lead, it's not about us. It's about Jesus, the good shepherd, who works in and through us. I'm thankful for the many good shepherds that are in this congregation already, for the many who feed and care for the flock in whatever capacity. We all know who they are. And all of us are called to care for the flock, are called to lead them by example, to lead them by life and love to an abundant, good, and joyful life. For that is what God intends for us. Abundant life, not misery and fear and dark valleys, but life. Thanks be to God.